All right. Thank you, everyone. Good afternoon. My name is Kimber Nicoletti Martinez, and I'm with Mesa Empowering Communities and Preventing Violence. We're housed on the Purdue University campus. And today I'm going to talk to you about preventing sexual violence across communities. And at one time, I might have framed this differently, but really just looking at no matter what community you're in, there's always differences in how you work with sexual assault survivors. So I'm glad to be here with you at the end of your day. We do work to prevent sexual violence. We provide education, support, community engagement, and crisis intervention. An area that we specialize in is in agricultural worker communities, but also other underserved populations. We also provide capacity building and technical assistance for other service providers to provide community affirming services to agricultural workers and for a wide variety of populations. Across the time that I've been doing sexual violence prevention work, I've worked with just a wide variety, any community that you could name. I used to, from our funder every year, be asked to develop outreach with a new population. And so but I come from a farm worker background, and so we do specialize in that. But I know I'm at the end of the day. Whoops. So I just wanted to check in with people and see how everyone's doing after a long day today, that you've all been online. So please type in the chat which of these cats most represent how you are, and then tell us what that reflects. We have cat A, kind of has its head laying on the keyboard. Maybe you feel like that after the day. Cat B with the party hat saying no. Let's see what some of the folks are saying here. We have Simi saying E. What's that mean for you, E? Just everything feels out of control. We have another E. Lots of E's up here today. Jesse saying A. Okay. And it says, see, I can smell something cooking. Gabriela, Isabel, and I don't know if that's Jamie or Jaime, but all with an A. So a lot of people kind of worn out from being on the computer all day today. So thank you, everyone, for sharing that with me. I thought the cats were fun. I've done this with weather. But I was like, look at these cats. Maybe that would be something to cheer people up at the end of the day. So, as I was saying, part of what we do is we do capacity building with other organizations to help them develop their strengths and assets to work across different communities and populations and really teach people about emotional intelligence and working with different communities and understanding some of those different nuances and how we might be more effective. I think that as we talk about that and we think about the idea of emotions, and I think of the transformers, that not like the cars that you can turn into computers, but really like electrical transformers. And one thing is that our energy is contagious. So we catch the moods and emotions of others. And as leaders, our emotions are the most contagious. And so it's important as we do capacity building and work with different communities that we're aware of our own emotions and our feelings and as we go about doing this work. I could get into a whole thing about mirror neurons, but that's not what we're here to talk about today. I've thought about this conversation that we were going to have a great deal. Because I thought, wow, an hour. Really, for people that are becoming advocates, what are the most important things I could share in an hour? One of the things that I think really is that every community is different. And it doesn't matter whether we're talking about working with farm worker communities. Even in the state of Indiana, I go to work with farm workers in the northeast part of the state. Their needs and their ideas and what they want and what they value. There might be some similarities, but it's also very different than maybe that same community. I have done focus groups where I went around all around the state and talked with different populations about how they felt about things or how they identified things. I asked this one question one time. I said, how do you define community? And this was particularly with different Latino groups across the state. And I had an idea. I was like, I know what they're going to say. I really thought I knew what they were going to say. And I was so wrong because every place that I went, people define community differently. Some people define community as their neighbor. Some people define community as people at their church. Um, None of them gave me the answer that I thought that they were going to give me. And so for me, that was a big lesson learned. And out of that, as well as every community is different, every person is different. So we know when we talk about culture that it's fluid. And so the way that I am is different than the way, let's say, that my mom is, because we've changed across the generations. In fact, my granddaughter, who on one side of her, she is Panamanian, on the other side of her, she's Mexican. And she didn't even recognize that she was a Latina because she has blonde hair and blue eyes. And so in every community, there's no way that you can say, I know these things about the communities, but that's something that we can think about today as we go and we work with survivors. And we can think about some general considerations when working across populations and communities. But then we go back to the first one and know that even if there's some general considerations, that every community is different and every person's different. And then as an advocate, when you go to work with survivors in different communities, you might consider different approaches based on the needs of that particular survivor. And a really important piece is also then to think about the role of the community and the family when working with survivors. And that can come in all different kinds of flavors and sizes, so that those are just 4 things I want you to think about learning today as we talk about this. And there's no way I can tell you all of it. It's just those are 4 things I want you to think about today. So when we think of elements of community, that community can encompass different values, beliefs, language, communication, practices of people that they all share in common, and that they can decide that defines them as a collective. So let me ask you a question. What aspects of your community might surprise people when they first meet you? Just describe 1 or 2 things about who you are that others may not recognize, and type that for me in the chat box. I know one thing I say to people is that when they hear me talking or when they see me, that a lot of people don't recognize is that as soon as I get off of the computer and I turn my head, besides talking to my dogs, that's a different language, right? But also is that I only speak Spanish at home. And so, but my mom brought us up she didn't want us to have an accent. So when I speak English, I don't know how my English accent is, but I try to make it as understandable as possible. So let's see what we have here in the chat box, what people are saying over here. I have a lot of tattoos, so people think I'm hard around the edges. All right. Anybody else want to share with us? What is something about your culture or community that might surprise people when they first meet you? Anybody else want to share? Let's see. Oh, okay. Wait, I heard somebody say no sabo kid. I unfortunately don't speak Spanish, but a lot assume I do. I am a no sabo kid. Thank you, Sophia, for sharing that. My granddaughter identifies as a no sabo. I'm Colombian, but I don't speak Spanish. All right. People think Africans are not educated. Shannon says I'm gender fluid, but people are surprised on my male days. Thank you. Thanks for sharing that. Anybody else want to share what might surprise people? I'm in my 30s, and my culture, it's very intergenerational. So many of my closest friends are retired and senior citizens. Hey, Mallory, thank you. I need friends too. Anna says people are surprised to hear that I'm educated and from Appalachia. All right, thank you. Anybody else want to share before we move on? Something that might surprise people when they meet you. So when we think about community, which we know is, I'm talking about culture, but I'm also talking about community because how that varies from place to place and depending on how people identify and who they see as their collective. Well, we know that it shapes a lot of things about us. It shapes the way that we approach problem solving, the way we communicate, our relationships, how one relates to authority, and help seeking, and healthcare. Now, you might be saying, like, well, Kimber, why are you telling all this? We know this. I'm telling you this because I want you to think about, as you are working as an advocate with survivors and they come to you, and they're talking to you about things, these are some of the things that are influencing how they share, maybe what kind of actions that they want to take, how they feel about things. I did some training for the DA office in Philadelphia with a group of law enforcement officers, and one of the questions that they had when we were talking about immigrant survivors was, why do they lie so much? And for them, it was hard for them to understand what could be the motivation of why people might, how they would relate to authority. They might not trust authority. When you talk about relationships, that could have to do with they don't want other people to know. They don't want people in their family to know because there can be cultural taboos. There can be, I worked with a woman one time when I was in the clinic, and she was a survivor of date rape, and then she married the guy that raped her, and then by the time I saw her, it was for domestic violence. And as she was telling me this story, it was because she felt like she couldn't go back to Mexico because people in the community would judge her. She had limited access to resources here. She was afraid to go to authority. You know, all of these different pieces that shaped the way that why she made the choices that she made. And as we talk about help seeking, that's an important aspect to think about as well, because in a lot of communities, help seeking is something that's done informally. So opposed to like going to an office, calling up somebody, making an appointment and things like that, people are more used to maybe seeking an elder, maybe talking to a community leader, maybe talking to a family member. That help seeking is done really informally. In some communities, it's really traditional medicine. So you might go sit with someone under a blanket, and there might be herbs and discussions like this, opposed to this kind of model where you go in an office. And this kind of ties in with healthcare as well. So, and as we think about these things and we think about how that would influence a community, and it would influence a person who's coming to see you or that you're helping out in the community. And I don't know how many of you are familiar with this, but there definitely is not a one size fits all. And how I know this is because every store that I've ever gone to that says, oh, here's this outfit and it's one size fits all, do you know what? It never fits me. And I always think that is a great analogy when we think about how we're going to help and advocate for survivors, because there definitely is not just a menu of like, well, this what works for everyone and this is what's going to work for you. So just remembering when we talked about that first lesson of every community is different and every person is different, there really isn't a one size fits all. I know there can be some tendencies, some things like offering support, but really there's not just a one thing that works for people. And then on the one size fits all, when we think about translation or interpreting, it's more than just changing words. So if we're helping people from a lot of different communities, there needs to be more of an effort that it seems like a place that is welcoming and that looks like help to them. I remember many years ago, it was a library, in fact, that they wanted to have more Latinos coming to the library. And they said, well, Kimber, why isn't anybody here? We made our signs in Spanish. We had chips. We had chichi salsa. And they just, for them, they thought they did these kind of baseline things. And they thought that was the way that they could reach the community and get people to come in. But really, it is translation or interpreting goes beyond just words. It goes to the level of connection, belonging, that list that we saw before, like help seeking, how people communicate, how people share information. And what, as we're talking about that, and we just went through that list, what places some victims and survivors at risk? Well, I bet a lot of you could guess what some of those things are. Lack of access to legal protection. So I often work with a lot of survivors and people in communities that don't have access to legal protection. And that could mean a lot of different things, right? We can go back a couple slides and talk about how people relate to authority, right? So it sometimes can be a perceived or a bias in the system that people feel like it's not really access to legal protection if I get there. And I've gone with a lot of people to the police station to make reports, and they were disbelieved. So for them, they no longer consider that an option. For other people, it is they don't know their rights. They're uncertain of their rights. Their rights are not implemented in a what's the word I want to say? Como se dice in the same way every time, right? It can be really dependent on the personality that they see. And so for them, they're like, what legal protection do I have? And it could also be other people around them saying they don't have legal protection. Then we get next to lack of language access. So when we talk about lack of language access, we might immediately think of, English and Spanish, but that also includes ASL as well as a lot. I mean, there's so many languages, right, in the world. So there are some places that use language line, but I've seen a lot of places, even though there's a law that says they have to provide language access, a lot of times they don't. I had a call, this was a few years back, and it was a woman and she was in a shelter. And it was actually in Kokomo. And she'd been in this shelter for 6 months. And they called me and they were like, Kimber, what do we do? This woman's been here. And I thought it was going to be like, Buenas tardes, right? No, this woman spoke a rare, ancient, indigenous dialect. And so she had been part of, in, in a prostitution ring. And so then we also couldn't reach out in the local community and ask people like, hey, who speaks this language? We then had to reach out further and further, and we didn't want to find a man that spoke the language. So then we finally found a volunteer in Iowa that spoke this language who was willing to come in. And when they called in to talk to this woman, she began crying because she'd been in this shelter for 6 months without being able to communicate with anyone. Then what about economic instability and poverty? Now that goes across a lot of communities, right? We can look at just any community that's dealing with economic instability and poverty. That puts people at risk. They feel like they don't have answers. Maybe they can't miss work. Maybe there's a connection between the person who harmed and the survivor. Like, what do they do in those kind of situations? And so just the economic instability, people are attached to work. Poverty, a lot of times they're isolated. There's that whole thing that at the top, right? Lack of access to legal protection or perceived lack of access because they don't know whether what they're going to, when they go in to make a report, whether they're going to be taken seriously or not. And then I kind of hinted at that earlier, but dependency on an individual with power. A lot of times people who are living with economic instability or some of those other things, language access or legal protection, a lot of times they're living in communities where they're dependent on a particular person that has more access to knowledge, more access to power. Maybe the power is transportation. Maybe the power is the ability to speak English. Maybe the power is having a phone. And so, you have someone in a situation and the person who's causing the harm is the person with the power. We had a situation many, many years ago when I worked in the clinic where a little girl was being sexually abused by someone who was living in the apartment with them. And the mother, who was undocumented, she didn't speak English, she didn't have a phone, she didn't have any ability to work, and she was completely dependent on this person with power. And so it put not only her, but her child at risk to be living in that situation. And then also the thing about social norms and biases. So really all of those things that I talked about before, those are things that put victims and survivors at risk because you mix all that up and that really is a recipe for vulnerability for people. So what are some of the critical ways that we can bridge connection to support victims and survivors? I don't know, type that for me in the chat box. What do you think are some of the ways that you can bridge connection to support victims and survivors from different communities? Anybody feel like sharing, learning more about different cultures? Anybody else? Not making assumptions? Yeah, exactly. Thinking about, immediate needs, right? Shelter, food, transportation. Yes. I do primary prevention work, and a lot of times in working with communities, you can't really address prevention until you address that Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right? That people have food. Simply asking questions when you're unsure. Thank you, Shannon. This is a great group. Look, you guys already know everything. So, kind of like what you were saying, letting them be the expert on their experience. Yes, thank you. Thank you. I can't find my button to put the hearts when you're saying things. But some support strategies for service providers really is like you're saying, let them be the expert. Ask simple, open ended questions as you're talking to people. I, a lot of times, because as we're, especially if we're talking about sexual assault, really it's often the thing you can't talk about. So in a lot of communities, you don't, it's the unmentionable. So you really have to frame it in a different way. But I'll try breathing or calming exercises with people, or I use stories or art to start conversations. I'll have Play-Doh, I'll have crayons, I do movement to get people, first of all, to help alleviate some of that stress that comes with maybe talking about things that people are taboos in their communities. And then it's also important to connect people to local support or groups that, especially if it's from a community that you don't have any affiliation with. Are there other organizations that, you got to double check them because you got to make sure that it is a safe and not traumatizing space for people. And then I also think it's important just to keep the conversation simple and supportive, not use a lot of jargon. I like what you're saying here, everyone. Like, let them be their expert, not making assumptions, helping connect them to immediate needs like shelter, food, transportation. And then when we think about trauma-informed care across communities, this is a farm worker housing picture I have for you. But, some of the core principles is it starts off with safety, right? Create physical and emotional environments that feel secure for every survivor. Now, a lot of times if you're working with a survivor that's transient or lives in like farm worker housing, that can be really challenging. Excuse me. But also developing that trust and transparency, communicate clearly about what will happen next, respect personal boundaries, not promise things that you can't be sure that are going to happen. And like, who was saying that here? Mallory? Yeah. Support the survivor's control over their own choices and healing process. Let them be their own best experts. And then, collaboration, work with survivors and community partners to help build pathways for support. And some communities, that's easier. There's things that are more readily identifiable. And then in other communities, you have to get more creative about that. And then also understanding impact, how trauma can affect body, mind, it can affect relationships. So, of course, I know you're not going to respond with judgment, but you want to respond with compassion. And sometimes especially, that's why we started off with thinking about who we are and what we believe, because sometimes it might be something that you might not be comfortable with, but it's really important that you respond compassionately. So you want to listen without interruption or assumptions, offer accessible language, appropriate resources, honor each survivor's values, history, and context. All of those things that help them feel connected. And after being out of control of their own life experience, to give them as much of that as possible. Believe them. Yes. Don't judge an experience you don't understand. Yes, thank you. Now, sometimes if we're working with some survivors, they can be somebody who has either experienced a single event of trauma or chronic trauma, right? So a single event of trauma is caused by one sudden, overwhelming incident like an assault, accident, a natural disaster. So you're dealing with a survivor, so they have already experienced that trauma, right? But then there's other kinds of traumas, right? Like I said, like an accident, a natural disaster. Survivors often recall a before and after moment. And then as you see here on the screen, a lot of times you'll have survivors that have came here and experienced life-threatening neglect, gone for days without food. Maybe if there was somebody with substance use issues in the family and all of the resources were used up. maintaining that, and the person went for days without food. Then surviving amidst violence in family and communities, war, immigration processes. A lot of times, people who try to enter without inspection will experience also a high risk for trafficking in that process. And children in circumstances where adults are trying to create a safe environment can be traumatized by the changing surroundings as much as a singular acute traumatic event. And so, you have children that are moved frequently. You change countries, where you go, and the rules, the norms are different, the connections, the family, the community that supported them. And so then you have a person that is experiencing trauma. And so as we think about that, and we think about how we want to start talking about this with people, it's important to remember in some communities the importance of spirituality. I've asked people often to draw for me what a healthy family looks like, or what a healthy community looks like, or what a healthy person looks like. And oftentimes people will draw a church or some connection to their faith. And so that as they think about their experience in trauma, it really has a foundation in their faith. Sometimes that can be a thing where they feel like, well, God wouldn't let this happen to them, or that it's something that they're supposed to like tolerate in relation to their spirituality. But it's important that you accept, as we're believing them, is that we understand how they frame spirituality. And also in a lot of communities, there's an oral history, right? There's not books that explains their life story, but rather it's things that have been passed down orally. I like this example is because I take my grandchildren to school on most days. And every morning, as I take them to school, I tell them stories, right? I tell them different stories about things that we believe, or how we do things, or why we make choices that we do, and that we share the stories down through generations. My grandmother has this story that she shared with me. It's not going to be your aha moment, but she told me that her father told her to always dry between your toes, and that things would go well in your life. Now, I never asked her why he said drying between your toes and things would go well with your life. Maybe it had to do with diseases back then or something. But I felt, here's my grandmother telling me something that her father told her. So then I felt compelled to tell my grandchildren, I'm like, look, this is a story that's been passed down, so I have to share this with you. So the other day I asked my granddaughter, who's 16, I said, do you dry between your toes? She said, yeah, I do, most of the time. So it's just this idea that in a lot of communities, we pass down this history through conversations, through dialogues, through stories, as well as this idea of synergistic view of health. For some people, health is like mental health is here, physical health is here. But in some communities, health is everything. Mental health is health. I had a lady one time who was sure she had cancer because she had pain in her legs. And she was like, oh, I have cancer, I have cancer. And she rubbed her legs. Well, she didn't have cancer. We went through the whole thing with the doctors. They were going to send her to an oncologist. But in reality, it was just for her, the acute adjustment disorder of moving cultures and being somewhere where she couldn't speak the language. She physically experienced that mental stress by having pain in her legs. So that's just one example of how there's a synergistic view of health. So a lot of times when you're working with survivors, they may not present with symptoms that you might see in, I don't want to say mainstream populations, because I just told you every community is different and every person's different. But what we might think of, what you see printed as, what you see symptoms that people might be experiencing, which might be, lack of sleep, inability to eat, a lot of the things we think of. And then also remembering the idea of informal approach to help seeking. So as you go to talk to a survivor, or in a setting, just remember that a lot of that informal approach to help seeking means the most important thing to do is to have a relationship with that person prior to getting down to business. So making the connection with them, going through some of those things, understanding who they are, what their priority is. So as I was saying, for us, A lot of our strategies for trauma informed support have to do with arts based, using creative expression to foster healing and voice, storytelling, invite survivors to share experiences in ways that feel safe and empowering, and sometimes you can use the art to facilitate the storytelling, especially as we're talking about sexual violence and it's something that people might be very uncomfortable in talking about. And then connecting the dots, recognizing the links between trauma, between behavior, between health, and then think about the context for people. Consider their life experiences, what kind of environment, and the stressors that shape their responses. So, when I was telling you in the beginning to think about the different approaches based on the needs of the survivor, these are just some of the things that you might think through. Some people it might these none of these might be the right approach, and you might have to think of something else. But it is always important to understand the context, what's going on, what's important to them, and then uh, I do think it's important to screen everyone, regardless of in a situation, maybe you have a family coming in and you have somebody who's there to make a report. You want to make trauma screening a standard practice, right? Just is there a chance that other people in the family are also experiencing trauma? And how's that impacting the survivor that you're working with? Now, do any of you use these approaches now? If you do, type them for me in the chat box and tell me about them. Anybody doing arts-based work or storytelling?
I'm the advocate for Southern Indiana, and I'm already looking into doing a 5-week group on art, basically trying to help people see that they're the whole of emotions, not just this one thing, and to like come back into feeling that their bodies are safe again and just
Uh-huh.
like processing all that stuff through art.
And what kind of art?
One of them is doing an abstract of 6 different emotions and not just like draw me anger. It's like, draw me an emotion that you don't like, but you feel too often.
Uh-huh.
And then have everybody tear them up, and then you collage with all the emotions. So it's like you're not just this one thing, you're a whole of things.
Right. That's great. Now, where are you at in Southern Indiana?
I'm representing Floyd and oh my gosh, what's the other one? Basically Jeffersonville, Clarksville,
Okay.
that area.
Great. Thanks so much for sharing. And see me, do you want to share with us?
Yeah, I first of all, that's super cool. I really like that whole process and that idea. I might have to steal it from you. But I do a support group for LGBTQ plus adults who have experienced domestic violence. And we do one at the end, the last group of every month, we do a kind of art-based kind of healing media, as I call it. People just present things that they've either created or things that have spoken to them very deeply. And it's just a really great way to build the connection and the trust between all of the support group members and myself,
Mm-hmm.
because I want to be seen as somebody that they can trust. And it just started as like a random idea, and it's turned into this whole thing now that my group members actively look forward to every single month. It helps them motivate themselves to be creative and to seek out those things. So it's, yeah, really powerful.
Wow, that's awesome. Thank you so much for sharing. Anna, I see that you have a peer support group that incorporates some arts and crafts in every session. Do you want to tell us about that? You don't have to, I'm just asking.
So, yeah, I work with the Center for Women and Families. Have a location in Louisville, Kentucky, and in Southern Indiana. But we have a few different peer support groups for survivors. But one of them is it's called Craft and Community. But we try to incorporate some kind of art or craft aspect during that group where survivors can kind of connect and share their story.
Wow, thank you so much. I see, Mallory, you have your hand raised.
Yeah. So I am like an advocate and counselor at a all women's college, and I do a lot of narrative therapy when it comes to like violence and trauma. And so what that helps me and my clients do is like identify any fallacies, negative thinking, or like self blame in incidents where we were not to blame. And so this kind of like reshaping our narrative is like really, really helpful. And I used to use it when I was a school social worker in elementary schools as well.
Oh, that's awesome. Thank you so much.
I'm a behavior manager in Marion County Sheriff's Office. And before we are able to determine the kind of resources to give the clients, we do a kind of screening, like an assessment. So for any behavior manager to be able to attend to any image, you have to go through the assessment process. So that's why I typed in the screening part. And for the storytelling, yes, we do a lot of storytelling. I facilitate the stop class for the survivors, and they tell their stories again and again when you don't want to hear it, when you didn't ask them. They just have new stories, probably prior to their incarceration or after incarceration or while they were young. It's a whole lot of storytelling every
Mm,
week.
thank you so much for sharing. Okay, let's see. Mallory, I know you said that. Anybody else want to share anything that they're doing that's arts based or storytelling, or we don't want to skip anyone? I know we're at the end of the day and everybody's like, hurry up, we're ready to go. Yeah, I think that there's a lot of different contexts that you can use these strategies, and it can help you reach communities that you might have differences with them, but you can develop some kind of commonality because that you're both humans and that find ways to connect and to listen. Let's see. So, I mean, I feel like you've been such a great group. Look at this. You've already said a lot of these things, but deep listening is so, so important. Listening without interrupting, listening like while you're really being present and you're listening and you're not thinking about what you're going to say next. You're not thinking about what they're going to say next. You're just being present and you're really listening. And as you're listening, I'm so sorry, you're trying to identify what's important to them and their story as they tell you, as they go through what they're expressing. Listen for that. Really, really listen. And then identify or address any judgment or assumptions that you may bring to the table. And you can say, well, I'm not that kind of person, but we can all be that kind of people, right? Where you don't think something's a thing for you. And then all of a sudden, if we use our emotional intelligence, we're paying attention to what's going on the inside. We're like, hey, what's this bubbling up for me? Then it's something that you need to address because that's not them, that's you. And you want to make sure as we're doing deep listening, it's hard for us to deep listen if we're sitting there thinking like, well, why'd you do that? So that's something. And then a really important part is to think about creating community connections, not only for yourself as an advocate, but also for people that you're serving. What are some connections that could help support them as they go through this process? I know a lot of you are talking about different kind of support groups. What are some other kind of connections that you can think of that you could connect people with? Could you type that for me in the chat box? You're all amazing leaders, so I know that somebody has some ideas that I haven't mentioned.
Maybe some cultural resources, like something that's specific to their culture. Like, I'm white. So let's say I have a Hispanic person. I would be like, okay, these are resources for your community that you can
Mhm.
have that community support you in a way
Mhm.
that I can't support you.
Mhm. Right. That's a great idea, Shannon. Thank you for sharing that. Anybody else have any other ideas of community connections? I find a lot of times in Latino communities that if they're in a situation where maybe there isn't a Latino cultural center or some sort of culturally specific organization, a lot of times there are different faith-based organizations that are doing outreach, but you have to little caution there is because that for some people they also might have religious trauma. So you want to make sure that you fully understand what is a helpful. You don't want to re-traumatize someone by referring them to a resource that then isn't supportive for them, isn't a good fit. And then I think that if you're in a situation with your organization that you can conduct some kind of, even if it's just brief and informal, some kind of community needs assessment to understand how you can better serve the community, what it is the community needs, or how they identify their wants. Kind of like getting back to the person who said, let everyone be their own expert. let the community be their own expert. Maybe if you're working as an advocate with an organization or in a different law enforcement agency or whatever kind of setting that you're on, find some way to conduct a small focus group or a listening session to see how you can better meet the needs of the community. I see somebody made a comment here. Our agency regularly sends out surveys to participants to get their feedbacks on how to better support them. And Ajia, what do you hear from that? What kind of feedback do you get?
So I do non-residential services here in Madison County for we're also a dual center, sexual assault and domestic violence. Part of our initial meetings at the end, we will put together a survey. It's just a quick link on SurveyMonkey. They fill it out. It's anonymous, so they can be very honest about their feedback. And then we review those. A lot of times the feedback that we get does pertain to the lack of culturally specific services and programming. So that is what the feedback is that there's the lack thereof. I think networking with other agencies that are already established has been a good way. We found some success there. When you don't know, ask somebody who does, and just using the connections that way, have found has been a good way to get clients connected. Is if you know an agency, you can make that referral, and then you learn where to go, in the future. So
And remind me where Madison County is. What town is Geneva,
we
Indiana,
are
and Madison?
we are about an hour 40. We're about 45 minutes to an hour northeast of Indianapolis. So we're between Indianapolis and Muncie, Indiana.
Okay, and what are some of the little towns in your county?
Anderson, Lick, Elwood.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. I've done a lot of outreach in Elwood, so I was like, gosh, that sounds familiar. What's in there? Elwood.
Yeah, right here
Yes, I
in
could
central
imagine
Indiana.
that. Yeah, there's definitely places in Indiana where finding linguistically appropriate, culturally appropriate services are hours away. We had
Yeah.
in Portland, Indiana, a couple of child sexual assaults, and we were just so challenged in trying to find advocates in that county that would serve them. So not only they didn't have a rape crisis center, and the closest one was like kind of hours from them. And then there was also the language barrier for people. So that's cool. Thanks for sharing that with us. Let's see. I'm now trying to catch up with what other people are saying. I always ask my clients what their needs are and how to help fill those needs. Mallory, I hear from clients in the past that they love giving back. So I used to organize events to help clients feel like helpers in the community. Very empowering. Anderson's J County. Thank you. Yeah, there's a lot of people that do different organizations that will do like a survivors group where they do work in the community, work to help prevent sexual violence, really getting engaged that way. But when we think about assessments here, it could include things like you're talking about sending out questionnaires, maybe key informant interviews or focus groups to reveal feelings, thoughts, concerns related to sexual violence, reporting barriers, as well as collaborating with other organizations within the community to identify how they see your strengths, your assets. Really, also that helps foster building rapport. Now, also that we've talked about this, but really the use of arts, music, poetry, theater. We do a lot of interactive theater in our work in the community, getting people to act out things and develop their own community-based solutions. And a lot of times we'll use that while people act it out. Then people in the community could be like, oh, what do you think of that? You might have seen a lot of this on college campus kind of things, but in community groups. And we've used this kind of information then to go on and to develop like photo novellas because it was based on community-based solutions, how they thought you should approach the situation, child sexual abuse or sexual harassment on the job. Mesa, we have a variety of photo novellas, so if you're interested in any of those, you could reach out to me. And then I know it's challenging anymore, but breaking bread together. We used to, every time that we would go out and do educational pláticas in Spanish-speaking communities, we would get someone else, either a church or an organization, to help sponsor the food because, we weren't allowed to buy food. So, but creating a moment to that you're eating food together, that you're kind of equalizing that power, that you're both two humans, or if you're in a group, everybody's just there eating and you're sharing, and it helps build that connection that's important for you to not only serve the survivor you're working with, but to serve the greater community. And then some of those effective skills we've talked about: listening without judgment, making sure that as you're listening, that your face conveys what your heart is saying. Practice your dancer's face so that you're sincere and you're listening. And some of us, especially as I get older, I notice my resting face can look like a lot of things. My kids tell me all the time my face doesn't always match. So I have to actually think about it like, there, do this, right? And then respect and humility, so important in a lot of communities. I mean, I think really every community, but some communities, humility is so important, that you come humbly. That could be like the number one thing on whether people trust you or not, is whether you're perceived as being arrogant or like that you know all the answers. And then respect. And then, like we started off at the very, very beginning, awareness of your own personal beliefs. And as an advocate, that can't come into play, right? I'm a vegetarian. I'll tell you right now, you know. But when people say they eat meat, I don't go, right? Because I told my granddaughter I've seen The Lion King, so I understand, right? It's the circle of life. And so really just being aware of your personal beliefs and making sure they're not interfering with your ability to serve other survivors. And then idea of acceptance of all feelings, right? Feelings aren't good. They're not bad. They're just feelings. And so it's okay for people to feel a variety of ways. And it's okay if somebody feels differently about something than you do, because that's all part of maintaining that open attitude. That really, we can embrace others, we can embrace survivors, we can embrace developing relationships and communities with others that may be different from ourselves. Now, I want to give you this opportunity to have a discussion, to come on screen, to come off mute. I'll stop sharing. I just showed you a variety of pictures there. See this little baby in the picture in the center? That is my granddaughter, who's actually now 12. So that picture's old. But I'd like to hear from you. Give me some feedback. What are you thinking? What are you already doing? What are you going to do differently? Beryl, I saw you came off mute, so you want to share with me?
Yes, actually, I wanted to not only share with you, but thank you for your presentation. And I'm particularly struck today by your languaging of your presentation. I work and our health centers are in Northwest Indiana. We're right there on the border. We're in Lake Jasper, Newton County, up in that area. And our organization is a federally qualified health center. And we have 9 sites in Northwest Indiana. And we're also a certified SANE site. And it's really important that for us that we're 27 years old. That's how long we've been in operation. And it's very important for us to make sure that we're non-judgmental, and I'm an old social worker. Been around a long time. Graduated college and graduate school a long time ago. The way I used to phrase this, and I talked about it in doing this advocacy work, because I've been around for a minute, and part of my social work has it's always been in public healthcare, rape crisis centers in Illinois, and now I'm in Indiana and Planned Parenthood, different places. But one of the things in my current health center, I've been there 15 years, and one of the things that we pride ourselves in is what I call the hospitality of the center. And when we talk about it in the community, because community networking and partnership is so important, especially for people of color right now. Want to make sure that people feel like when you walk through the door, this is a breathing moment for you. And tell us how and what you need to do in order to breathe. We're certified both federally and by the state as an integrated behavioral health primary care site. So we offer a number of things, but more importantly, we do that um, um, balance assessment. We have a behavioral health department with a PhD director of behavioral services and staff. And so part of our assessment for not only new but continuing patients is to ask, do you feel safe at home? And no matter what they come in for dental care, for pediatrics, whoever's bringing the children in, for family medicine, for OB-GYN, for whatever you come in for, pregnancy tests or, HIV tests, Hep C, we want to make sure that people know that we care about if they're safe. And that manifests itself in a lot of different ways. I'm part of the administrative staff. And when we do training, we have staff development, staff training. And one of the things that we don't tolerate is people not being treated respectfully. And if you're at the front desk, even if you're maintenance, it's important. And we model that. And we look at behavior from our staff to determine if they're feeling overwhelmed at that moment. They know that it's not okay to project that on anybody, patients, coworkers, or anybody. But if you need a moment, then you need to convey that to your supervisor, your manager, and take your moment. Because people who are coming through our doors have a variety of issues that they're dealing with. We see people who haven't eaten for 3 or 4 days, families. People, I just got here. I walked here from emergency room. Behavioral health did a staff education and they talked. We've been a certified integrated site since 2015. And they gave us just a menu of the kinds of things that they see. And it's getting the understanding from family medicine, from dental, from optometry, that these are the same people that you may be seeing. And so when you interface with them, it's important that I'm not saying that everything is rosy every day. That's not at all what I'm trying to convey. But we do have a standard of care, excellent in our service delivery. And I don't care if you come in smelling like you haven't had a bath in a few days, or whether you have the designer perfume or designer bag. But we're in Northwest Indiana, so again, and that's always talked about. And that's what helps us. That's always talked about at providers meeting, at medical assistant training, at registrars meeting, at administrators meeting on all different levels. And the providers are buy-in. It took difficulty to get buy-in from all of these MDs, PhDs. We also have chiropractic services who look out for or the people that they're doing chiropractic services with because they're touching their body. They're asking people permission. So it's an integration is what I'm trying to
Yeah. That's
express.
awesome. So really at every level in your organization, they're always screening people for trauma.
It is. And from our CEO to my position, which I have a background in advocacy, and as I said again, that identifying and being able to know trauma-informed care services are from the front door to the back door and in between.
There you go. That's amazing, Beryl. Thank you so much for sharing. We only have a few minutes left, so does anybody else have something they'd like to share or ask? Thank you so much, Beryl, for sharing
Thank
so
you.
much.
Thank you. And thank you, everyone, for their comments. That's helpful, too.
Any other comments or questions? Yes, so much love. Thank you, Shannon.
How would you go about asking questions about culture and community in a way that doesn't come off as microaggressions. I'm always concerned that being that I don't know about different cultures as much, um, I'm going to say the wrong thing and say something offensive, and I really don't want to. So, like, how do you come to communities be like, I don't know about that. Can you explain? Like, I think I'm rambling a little bit.
Well, so and are you speaking of a particular community that you're thinking of that you work
Sh-
with a lot,
Um,
or?
I'm new to the position. I'm also with the Center for Women and Families. I just got hired on as their SA advocate for Clark and Floyd counties. So, but I just, we were talking about in training like microaggressions for minority groups. And, you know, I am very aware that I am white and with that comes like privilege and sometimes ignorance. So I just want to make sure that I'm not coming from a place that could do more harm, if that makes more sense.
Well, first of all, I appreciate your heart and your awareness of that you're starting off with that. But I would say in most situations, it really comes down to not asking out of curiosity, right? Not asking just because you're curious about something, but if it's something that's important to know, you can ask, do you have a language preference? You could just ask people questions, right? Just make sure that you're doing it humbly, with respect, but also not out of curiosity. Really, as a social worker, that was one of the first things that they taught us was that when you meet with people, not to ask things because you're curious. Only ask it if it's important to the work that you're doing with them, right? And so, but let's ask some others. What are your thoughts on what Shannon says? How could she make sure that she's not being offensive when she's trying to reach out to people of different cultures and ethnicities? Anybody have any advice for Shannon? Sophia?
Sorry, let me see if I can get this going. Hello. Hi.
Hello.
I'm fairly new to this field as well. I'm from Fairhaven. At the beginning in the morning, Becca spoke. She's my supervisor. But I would say being like a minority myself, I am Black and I'm Mexican, but I think not a lot of people either notice that I'm either or. So like sometimes people like assume I'm one and not the other. So there's a lot of confusion in that. But I think just I would say some good advice because I come from a very diverse area. I would say just on your own time, educating yourself is the best thing to do. Also, just, it's okay to not know things and apologize, when you learn about them and educate yourself. Like, so I don't know, that's my best advice, but it's nothing wrong with like apologizing, making genuine mistakes.
Okay. Thank you so much, Sophia. Great advice. That's great advice. Anna?
Hi. Yeah, I just kind of had a question to your response to Shannon, where I work, we come at the angle of like asking questions out of curiosity, of it being like, yeah, like, we like are just asking questions out of curiosity just to either get to know whether it's a client or even a coworker. So I guess kind of my question is how I guess can you kind of change that perspective, or at least for me, of seeing like asking something out of curiosity and how that could come across as like the impact might not be what my intention is. Where if it's like, oh, I'm trying to get to know you, just want to make sure I can have the resources that you need, like make sure you're getting the access that you need without having it possibly be an impact that like I'm not intending to have where it could be offensive or possibly uncomfortable.
Right. I think that's a great question, Anna, because I think a lot of times when people are asking things out of curiosity, because I think that's also some cultural differences there, right? That in some communities, it's very like, oh, what's that? Where do you work? And then in other communities, you sitting there asking me all of those kind of questions. I'm like, wow, you're asking me all this kind of stuff, right? So for me, I think it's a lot about inviting people into dialogue, starting with some general things, and then you're doing that deep listening. So you're listening to little nuggets that they're providing you, right? And then just building on that in a conversation and getting people to open up to you because you've instead of feeling like an invasive species, instead you're inviting them into I'm a human and you're a human kind of dialogue, right? And so, and like Sophie was saying, like some of that is also doing some of your own research. I took a group of sexual assault advocates to Pine Ridge Reservation. And I wrote up this sort of how-to booklet, right, for how to engage with Native Indigenous communities in a way that's not offensive, but that builds community. And some of it had to be, some of the people when they got there, were like, I said, what you want to do, the first thing you get here is you don't want to say, where's the gift shop, right? There's just like lots of things that are cultural norms here that show that you come from too much privilege, right? That you would go to some community, and that doesn't show humility. So, but inviting someone into a relationship, like, how are you today? Just like basic kind conversation. I know for some introverts, like that small talk is hard, but it's the way that you open the door and invite people to share with you, right? You don't invite yourself in.
So I like what you said. Building a relationship definitely makes it easier to like connect with people more, and even just in life and in this career, just having more diverse people in your life is very beneficial.
Yes. Well, I see that we've reached our time, so I really appreciate everyone hanging out with me today. I put my email address in the chat box for you because I realized I didn't do the classic slide at the end with my contact information. So, Kimber at Purdue. Really, if you just Google Kimber Nicoletti Martinez, I promise you'll find me.